Out there is a tiny bunch of people who are decently educated in some fields of science. They make some unusual claims. On the mere surface, their claims sound sufficiently articulated. I'm talking about inferring intelligence from design. I've looked around to see how people respond to the challenge. To my surprise, I have even heard some qualified scientists competent in the field of interest go at some length in refuting the argument. I'm making this video because it seems to me they go even too deep into the technical details to explain why the design argument is flawed. Perhaps they give too much credit to the argument of their opponent, feeling the need to actually focus on the scientific content of the sponsored counterexamples. I think that's indeed granting too much recognition to those people. My opinion is that they shouldn't even start to delve into concrete examples from, let's say, biology to refute these claims. Here I'm proposing a much more radical and absolute rebuttal. My guess is that I'm not the only one to have pointed this out, so I'm sorry if I'm not being original. However, I haven't found quite the same arguments in what I've looked into. Maybe I should read more or watch more. So the argument I'm refuting here so goes. We can make this the following analogy. Let's say we see a computer or a seemingly carved stone, sharp and pointed, of the type you would think could be used as a rudimentary primitive weapon for hunting. From the design we infer the existence of a carver, a forger, an engineer, an architect. The more or less complex, non-random design allows for a purposeful functionality. From this observation, the argument goes, we may also comfortably infer from identifying the design alone the subsistence of intelligent design. By analogy, just by looking at how complex we are today, we should, if we were honest and consistent, infer design. This design is said to permeate biological living forms, and therefore, this is the proven link, an intelligent designer must exist. My proposal is that scientifically this claim has to be rebutted a priori as a null argument. For how captivating it is if it is to be taken as some sort of proof in the positive or bearing any scientific relevance, it is actually in blatant contrast with the very concept of science that we have framed in modern times. I can think of at least three independent arguments that, scientifically speaking, can rebut this proposal a priori, without even delving into the details of how a computer and a human being function. Bear in mind that this is the only argument used by most of these people to prove their theory, as opposed to other theories. First, let me point out that applied science does not progress at all through abstractions and statements that have the only merit of carrying logical internal consistency. To argue in defense of such eventuality, in fact, would be the same as going back to the Aristotelian approach, precisely the one that had to be defeated for modern science to make any progress. That is, the premise of logical appeal, consistency, or soundness over observation of natural phenomena. In this now abandoned scheme, if an observation defies rational abstract logic and established philosophy, then the natural phenomena or explanation thereof must be wrong. I'm saying this just to argue, first of all, that taken alone the design argument as just described cannot prove anything in the positive about how we came about as living beings. Nor does, of course, the refusal of the design argument. That is, even if I decline the validity of the design argument, that alone doesn't automatically imply that natural selection is the relevant mechanism in evolution. Without any other data, it is simply useless and at most an advertisement for philosophers to discuss it. In fact, in science, the requirement for the best theory is not that it should be more sound or appealing than another, but that it fits the data better and can provide useful predictions. That most scientific theories come along with at least some rational soundness is a consequence of the regularity of nature, not of the premise of human reason over observation. So the design argument, as opposed to the non-design hypothesis, cannot tell us anything so long as it doesn't tell us anything new in regard to, let's say as an example, why whales are mammals and were not around together with the first primitive fish, why they popped out of existence of the millions of years later, why the pattern of extinction of dinosaurs and the evolution of mammals from small subdominant to large and dominant are related. Some examples in modern science of why the plausibility or soundness of an isolated statement aren't relevant per se. Take Einstein's theory of special relativity. Take the statement that the passing of time depends on how observers might be moving with respect to one another. What is in it that is more rational, more sound, more acceptable, more trustful than the notion that there is an absolute time? None whatsoever. They're both rational, acceptable, and legitimate notions. If we came to prefer Einstein's proposal, it's because of observation, not of self-sustaining and self-feeding logic. With quantum physics, the story is many times worse. It defies logic and rationality in several points, but we must go beyond classical concepts and embrace quantum physics if we want to make progress. Should we abandon quantum physics tout court because we cannot make any analogy in its regard so that we can relate it to everyday experience? Of course not. Let me show you why, in science, arguments of the type used in the case of intelligent design are incorrect. I will call the intelligent design argument an argument of inference from analogy. There are a few examples that show why this argument is flawed. The analogy argument can be, at best, a hint, a hunch for someone who is struggling to develop a new theory. That might happen sometimes because the job is made easier if we can relate the phenomena we are studying to some already known theory or explanation. However, it doesn't guarantee success, as most scientists who came up with a revolution in new theories would assure you. Another place for the argument from analogy can be a posteriori, whereby the analogy might be helpful to explain the new theory in terms that are more familiar to the listener. But per se, without the support of evidence, it is void. The analogy could be as well as right as wrong. Take, for example, this analogy. Atoms at early times were seen as planetary systems with the nucleus as the star and the electrons as the orbiting planets. The analogy was indeed used for some time because, to some extent, it was sound that fitted experiments and helped in understanding. But at some point, that analogy had to be quickly abandoned. The analogy per se was just as sound then as it is today, but today we know it is limited and especially misleading if taken literally. My challenge for today is for you to find how many more down-to-earth examples as you like from your everyday experience of many situations in which the inference from analogy fails and deceives. Let's turn to the second argument. Maybe it's not as strong as the other two. I'll skip rapidly through it. My observation is that the inferred design is a subjective and not objective experience. We infer design by analogy with the very similar objects that we are capable of designing. Not because of an objective property. By analogy with other things that we build and their architecture, we conclude that another human must have made it. Design is also strictly related to the function of the object, but that is because we know how we design things for those purposes and argue by similarity. Nevertheless, we can use stars and galaxies as phenomenal calendars, and have you ever seen such snowflakes at the microscope? They would fit very well in an art gallery. Something may look designed but not have a purpose, as well as look not to be designed but usable for a purpose. So, how do we establish scientifically the objective purpose of designs? We can't. We only infer design when we recognize the tracks of human design because we understand how we humans like to design things. Finally, my preferred argument. The fact is that the inference from design is wrongly applied too. It doesn't even work. Let me ask you this. If you see a computer, which one do you infer? It was designed and manufactured, or it came about by chance one morning, or it was born from another computer? What do you answer? I guess number one. If you see me, what do you infer? That I was manufactured or designed, that I came about by chance one morning, or that I must have had two parents that conceived me? I hope you infer number 3. So, the inference by design is totally flawed because everyone infers that behind a computer there must be a designer and a manufacturer, certainly not a parent, and everyone infers that a human being was once conceived, not engineered. In fact, the proposers of this flawed analogy must make an additional hypothesis, that contrary to what we infer with the computers and the living beings that we encounter today, for some obscure reason we must conclude that there were several living beings in the past that, rather than having parents, were, to some degree, manufactured. So the inference in itself is flawed, while for all engineered objects I can also tell you how they were engineered, with what instruments, taking advantage of which physical laws. The design guides that cannot tell us how living beings were engineered and according to which physical principles. So the inference from design is at the same time scientifically inherently useless, subjective, and also wrong and flawed. So I don't see why one should even bother to explain how certain biological machines work or evolved to rebut this attack.